By 7:30 on Saturday morning, the Hastings market already smelled like kettle corn, wet wood pallets, and diesel exhaust. Pickup doors slammed in a rhythm that sounded almost like applause. Younger growers rolled in with polished dually trucks and enclosed trailers wrapped in vinyl logos, sunrise gradients, drone photos of fields, websites in clean white font. A black GMC Denali idled near the center aisle with chrome wheels that probably cost more than Katie Jordan's entire market setup. Next to it, a woman in a branded puffer jacket unloaded hydroponic lettuce from a refrigerated unit that had a sticker price of $68,000, and a man in mirrored sunglasses talked loudly about the delivery date on his new $410,000 tractor, as if anyone had asked. Katie arrived in a faded red 1994 Ford with one cracked taillight and a tailgate that needed a shoulder shove to latch. The passenger door had rust blooming around the handle like old freckles. She parked crooked, corrected once, then killed the engine. When she stepped down, people noticed what they always notice first: the torn leather sandals she'd repaired with baling twine and a strip cut from a feed sack. Her jeans were clean but thinned at the knees, her flannel shirt sun-bleached at the shoulders, and her phone, when she set it on the table beside a legal pad, had a spiderweb crack running across the entire screen. "Morning. Barefoot, Katie?" called Vernon Lyle from 3 stalls down, smiling with the kind of friendliness that always carried a little blade in it. Vernon farmed 2,300 acres, financed nearly all of it, and wore a logo jacket embroidered with Lyle Family Farms in gold stitching. He nodded toward her handwritten price cards. "You know they make card readers now. This isn't 1998. Katie smiled without looking up. "Cash still spends in 2026, Vernon." He laughed for his own audience, 2 younger farmers in clean boots and expensive sunglasses. "Sure, till it doesn't." They all looked past her stand toward the sweet corn piled in waxed crates. No branded tablecloth, no social media sign, no QR code for online pre-orders, just neat rows of ears, a coffee can full of change, and block letters on index cards. Sweet corn, $6 per dozen. People read wealth quickly in Adams County. New machine, big farmer, new truck, Goodyear, new boots, must be doing all right. Katie looked like somebody one hailstorm away from an auction flyer posted on the co-op bulletin board. Folks said she kept it simple, with that tone people used when they meant can't keep up. Even the teenagers loading melons for summer money whispered that she must be hanging on by her fingernails. No one saw the ledger she kept in a metal file box under the table, every page dated, every margin full of notes. No one saw the numbers she could recite from memory: fuel burn per acre by field, seed return by hybrid, 5-year average repair costs by machine hour, tax liabilities mapped quarter by quarter. Nobody at the market understood that her plain stand and patch sandals were not symptoms. They were strategy. By 10:30, she'd sold through half her corn and all her tomatoes, collected mostly 20s and 5s, and made exact change faster than customers could tap phones. On her way out, she passed the Denali again. Its owner was posting a video of his display to social media, panning slowly over polished apples while narrating growth plans into the camera. Katie slid behind her cracked steering wheel, twisted the key twice before the engine caught, and drove home with a coffee can of cash-riding shotgun, looking exactly like a woman losing ground. She had looked that way, more or less, since 1999. That was the year the bank took her parents' 160 acres. Katie was 26 then, still lean from lifting hay and too stubborn to cry in front of people. Her father, Don Jordan, had refinanced twice in the late 90s. First to cover equipment upgrades that sales reps called efficiency, Then again after 2 poor yield years and a drop in corn prices. The final note came at 9.8% interest. Katie remembered the number because her father wrote it on a yellow envelope at the kitchen table, circled it 3 times, and stared at it like it might blink and become mercy. It didn't. Interest accumulated whether the rain came or not. It accumulated while they slept, while they calved out heifers in February cold, while they skipped doctor visits and patched tractor tires with plugs and prayer. In August of 1999, they sold the North 80 to make a payment and bought 6 months. By March, they were behind again. The banker in Hastings wore a tie with tiny pheasants on it and said words like restructure and temporary liquidity strain while sliding papers across polished oak. By fall, the papers had a sheriff's stamp. Katie remembered the auctioneer's chant as a kind of fever dream. Numbers running together, strangers bidding on things she'd touched since childhood. Her mother stood with both hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee that went cold. Her father stared at his boots until the bidding ended and somebody else owned soil that held his footprints. After the sale, Katie made one private vow and one public one. Publicly, she said she'd keep farming if she could lease ground. Privately, she promised herself she would never again pay compound interest to keep food in the ground. If she borrowed at all, it would be short, fixed, and hunted down like a coyote before it bred. She met Ben Jordan at a machinery consignment sale 2 years later, arguing over a used grain cart neither of them could really afford. He was broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, and had the patient hands of a mechanic. They married fast and poor. Their first apartment was over a feed store. The bathroom window wouldn't close in winter. They set a household draw at $42,000 a year, non-negotiable, and built their life inside it like framing a house. Intentionally, square, nothing decorative unless it paid for itself. When they bought their first 80 acres together, the note was $312,000. They took a 15-year amortization and paid it in 14 by killing every extra dollar of principal they could find. Tax refund, principal, side income from Katie's market stand, principal, Ben's winter welding jobs, principal. 1 year they sold a calf crop at strong prices, and instead of celebrating with a trip, they sent $19,400 straight to the lender and ate spaghetti for a month. Their friends upgraded pickups every few years. Katie and Ben drove trucks until odometers rolled past 250,000 and body panels were more rust than paint. They didn't eat out much. They didn't vacation. They didn't buy machinery because it was pretty. If they couldn't explain the return in less than 2 sentences, they didn't buy it. When the note finally cleared, Ben carried the release letter in his shirt pocket all day. That night, he tacked it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like Nebraska and said, "Now we keep this feeling." They tried. For years they did. Ben died at 53, sudden and quiet, a heart that stopped before the ambulance could cross town. Katie buried him in March wind. She ran spring prep alone 6 weeks later because fields don't pause for grief. For the first year after he was gone, she moved like someone speaking a second language. Functional, careful, a little detached. But she held to the same rules, especially the money rules. Maybe because they were the clearest part of him she could still touch. Over the next decade, she expanded slowly and mostly through patience. She bought land when estates needed clean closes, and she could pay substantial cash. Then small notes. She retired fast. She leased smart, avoided bidding wars, and walked away when rents exceeded what realistic yields could support. She owned 1,120 acres outright by the time people in town started calling her old-fashioned to her face. They weren't entirely wrong. She was old-fashioned in the way gravity is old-fashioned. She ran the farm the same way each year, budget first, ego last. In January, she built a line item sheet by hand, then checked it against 5-year averages and stress-tested it for drought pricing. She did not accept "it'll probably be fine" as a planning method. For equipment, she preferred auctions where patience beat pride. At one sale outside Juniata, she bought a used combine for $71,000, a machine with good maintenance records and 2,300 separator hours, while a neighbor signed on a new model at $387,000 financed over 7 years at 6.4%. People joked about her museum fleet. Katie calculated that the difference in purchase cost and interest, invested annually, could buy another piece of ground by retirement. She kept 3 coffee tins of labeled bolts in her shop, rebuilt hydraulic lines herself when she could, and paid independent mechanics cash when she couldn't. A younger farmer once teased her for changing her own fuel filters. "Because I like being greasy," she said. He shrugged. "Because you're cheap." She tightened the filter, wiped her hands on a rag, and answered, "Because shop labor is $124 an hour, and this takes me 18 minutes. Where others chased visual signs of growth, Katie chased margin. She bought fertilizer early if discounts beat storage and cash timing made sense. She prepaid insurance when possible. She laddered reserves into CDs and 4.9% Treasury bills rather than letting idle cash evaporate in checking. She tracked input costs down to the acre and sold grain in disciplined tranches rather than gambling everything on one market spike. Her office wall held no motivational posters, just a whiteboard with 3 lines. Yield is weather, price is market, debt is choice. People mistook that discipline for fear. In late February, fear finally came to find her anyway. The Adams County Co-op had eaten 2 ugly defaults in 1 quarter, high-profile operations, big acres. Bigger notes, both sunk by variable rate operating lines and a bad basis swing. The board met behind closed doors and emerged with a new policy. Any grower without an active bank-backed operating line had to prepay 50% on seed, fertilizer, and diesel before delivery scheduling. The announcement hit like sleet. Katie read the email twice at her kitchen table. Her spring inputs totaled $138,400. Under the new policy, she had 7 business days to remit enough to hold delivery slots. Miss the window and she'd slide behind in a season where timing was survival. In Nebraska, planning dates don't care about your paperwork. She called the co-op manager, Darren Pike, whom she'd known for 15 years. "Darren, you know my account history." "I do," he said, sounding tired. "This isn't personal, Katie. Board rule. No active line, no exception." "I have no line because I don't borrow operating." System tags that as unverified credit profile. She let that sit between them. Unverified. As if 27 years of paid invoices weren't verification. By noon, the rumor mill had done its work. At the coffee counter in town, someone said she was finally getting exposed. Someone else said cash-only farmers were quaint, until real money was required. Vernon Lyle stirred powdered creamer into his cup and, loud enough for 3 tables to hear, said, "This is what happens when you try to farm poor." That afternoon, First Plains Bank called before she called them. "Miss Jordan, we can structure an operating note quickly," said Caleb Wren, a loan officer young enough to use the phrase "solution set without irony." 11.25 variable, standard covenants, blanket lien on equipment, and future crop proceeds. We can move fast if you need liquidity. A blanket line. On her equipment, her crop, effectively her year. She thanked him and said she'd review terms. Given the deadline, he added, I'd encourage urgency. Urgency was what banks called it, when interest meters started running. Katie hung up, opened her legal pad, and wrote 3 numbers at the top of a clean page. 11.25%, 7 days, $138,400. Then she sat for a long time in the quiet kitchen, hearing only the refrigerator hum and the wind rubbing dry branches against the siding. By evening, texts arrived from neighbors offering advice she hadn't requested. Her nephew, Tyler, drove over after chores and stood by the mudroom door, cap in both hands. "Aunt Katie, I love you, but you can't thrift your way through modern agriculture," he said. "Everybody leverages now. That's just how scale works." She looked at him, kind but unbending. "Scale for who?" He didn't answer. Outside, dusk settled over fields still winter bare, waiting. Inside, Katie turned the page and began listing options in tight, neat print. The county was leaning in to watch whether the woman in torn sandals would finally borrow. She kept writing until the light was gone. She kept writing until the light was gone. Then she stood, flipped on the stove light, and pulled a gray banker's box from the pantry shelf above the canning jars. The lid was marked in black marker, years / cash flow / do not toss. Inside were 27 manila folders, one for every season since the auction that took her parents' ground. She carried the box to the table, sat down again, and started laying folders out in a row on the oilcloth like a timeline of weather and consequences. She wasn't guessing whether she could cover $138,400. She was checking how fast, from where, and what it would cost her to move the money. In 2000, her first full year farming leased acres after her parents lost theirs. She'd worked 240 acres and finished with $18,700 after rent, fuel, seed, and repairs. Household draw, $29,000. She'd written in the margin that year, "No new debt unless crop physically fails." In 2001, after she and Ben married, they ran 320 acres, and he welded nights at a machine shop outside Juniata. Net farm income, $34,200. Welding income, $11,400. Extra principal paid, $8,000. In 2002, corn prices sagged, and they still paid $12,500 extra on the land note by skipping every non-essential purchase they could think of, including a pickup they badly needed. Katie had written, "Keep old truck alive 1 more year equals 6 months interest saved." 2003 and 2004 were better, not easy. They added rented acres, replaced a failing planter with a used one bought at consignment for cash, and put their first $25,000 into a 12-month CD at 3.1%. Ben had drawn a tiny smiley face next to that line item and written, "Money that earns while we sleep." In 2008, when inputs jumped and everyone was talking scale, they did what looked small and what proved large. They didn't raise household draw. They didn't finance a bigger combine. They kept grinding principal. By fall 2009, despite market swings, total debt had dropped below $140,000. In 2011, they made a choice people teased them about for a decade. Instead of replacing their grain truck, they rebuilt the transmission and patched the floor pan, then used the difference, $42,000 they didn't spend, to prepay part of a neighboring 40 that came up in an estate sale. That 40 later became one of their best irrigated parcels. In 2013, after a dry year, they shifted reserves from a near-zero checking account into a ladder. 3 CDs maturing at staggered dates, 1 6-month treasury bill. Liquidity without temptation. Safety without stagnation. In 2014, the land note was gone, paid in 14 years, one early, just like they'd promised each other. Katie paused there and touched the folder edge with her thumb. Ben's handwriting disappeared after 2015. She kept going. From 2016 to 2020, she bought 2 tracts when families wanted clean closes and fast money, not long contingencies. She paid substantial cash down. Then short notes retired ahead of schedule. She never bid against emotion. If an auction got stupid, she went home. She lost more parcels than she won. That was part of why she still had money when opportunities came that penciled. In 2023, while neighbors were still digesting purchases made on high commodity prices and low-rate optimism, she bought Treasury bills at 4.9% and locked them in a separate line item marked Spring Input Backstop. In 2023, she sold old grain inventory in disciplined tranches while others held out for one more rally. She took less upside and more certainty. Her average sale beat break-even by enough to refill reserves before winter. By 2025, her annual operating pattern was almost boring in its consistency. Preseason budgets, conservative yield assumptions, no machinery payment, no land payment, taxes accrued monthly, repairs funded from cash flow, and any surplus split between maintenance reserve, taxes, and short-term safe instruments. Boring had built a wall around her. At midnight, she totaled liquid and near-liquid amounts she could access inside 7 business days without touching long-term structure. The number came back higher than she expected, even with conservative assumptions. She drew a box around it and wrote, "Can wire full. Confirm with Ruth." Ruth Engel had handled Jordan Farms taxes for 18 years and tolerated no drama, no fantasy, and no unlabeled receipts. Her office was above a dental clinic on Burlington Avenue, 2 flights up with fake ficus trees and carpet that held the memory of every winter boot in Adams County. Katie was in Ruth's chair when the office opened Monday. Ruth scanned the co-op notice, then looked over her glasses. They tagged no operating line as unverified credit. Katie nodded once. That is the dumbest, technically legal sentence I've read this month. Ruth turned to her monitor and started pulling files. Let's not argue policy. Let's measure options. For 2 hours, they moved through hard numbers. Grain inventory on hand. Estimated receivables. Cash and cash equivalents by maturity date. Tax reserve set-asides. Property taxes due in May and November. Upcoming lease payments. Pre-committed repair costs for planting. When they were done, Ruth swiveled the monitor so Katie could see the worksheet. Conservative valuation today, Ruth said, tapping each line with a capped pen. Owned acres. 1,120 at $8,900 per acre. $9,968,000. Equipment fair value. $640,000. Grain inventory. $412,000 at current bid assumptions. Cash and near cash, $1,386,000. Liabilities, routine payables, taxes, no structural debt. Net worth, roughly $12.2 million. Katie stared at the screen without expression, like she was looking at rainfall totals. Ruth leaned back. You are not the person in this county who needs a rescue line at 11.25 variable. I know, Katie said. I need delivery slots. Then buy certainty. At 10:42 a.m., from Ruth's office, Katie called Darren Pike at the co-op and asked for final amount due if she prepaid full spring inputs instead of half. Darren put her on hold, came back, and gave her the number with an audible exhale. If paid in full by Wednesday, we can apply 2% early settlement discount, he said. That had reduced total by $2,768. Katie looked at Ruth. Ruth nodded. Email wiring instructions, Katie said. I'll remit today. There was a beat of silence at the other end, then a different tone in Darren's voice. Not warm exactly, but reset. I'll send them now. By noon, the wire was gone. By 2, 3 people had texted asking if she'd taken First Plane's line. By 3, Vernon Lyle had heard she paid cash and called it a stunt to anyone within 10 feet of him at the feed store. Katie ignored all of it and went back to checking seed tender dates. The county's argument about debt wasn't really moral. It was arithmetic under pressure, and pressure had changed. At Bull's Bridge Implement that week, men in seed caps stood by a new 8R and talked interest like weather forecasts. One said his operating renewed at prime, plus 3.75. Another said his lender moved him to monthly reporting and additional collateral after year-end ratios slipped. Nobody sounded panicked yet. Everyone sounded tired. Vernon, who never missed a crowd, rested a boot on a pallet of hydraulic fluid and made his case to the room like he was selling a package. Look, you can't run 2,000 acres with 1990s iron and coffee cans, he said. Speed matters. Efficiency matters. Technology pays. On a lot of days, he wasn't wrong. Vernon's auto steer and section control cut overlap. His variable rate maps improved placement. Newer planters did plant more acres in narrower windows. His gross revenues looked enormous, and some years they were. What Katie heard, and what Vernon didn't say out loud, was cost of carrying the speed. His 2022 machinery roll-up had totaled around $2.1 million across 3 notes. Low rates had made it feel manageable then. By this spring, 2 notes had reset higher. Interest alone had risen enough to erase a lot of precision gains. At the coffee counter, the same split played out with different faces. Mason Ryder, who farmed with 2 brothers east of Roseland, had expanded from 1,100 acres to 3,400 in 5 years, mostly leased. They built a new grain setup, financed bins, and signed a variable operating line pegged to SOFR plus a spread. When rates were low, the model worked. Then base rates climbed fast. Their annual interest expense jumped from roughly $96,000 to $218,000 in 18 months. Not because they got lazier, because the price of money changed. Across town, Paula and Jeff Holland ran a dairy and row crop mix with relentless work and thin margin. They financed a parlor upgrade at 5.2% fixed, then had to add short-term operating debt at double that when feed costs spiked and milk checks lagged. They were good operators, not reckless. Their problem wasn't character. It was stacking obligations in a cycle that stopped forgiving timing errors. Even the younger growers with social media polish were juggling invisible strain. Branded trailers, clean hats, polished displays. Those were business choices too, often smart ones for direct sales. But behind the optics, more than a few were floating 6-figure operating notes that had gone from annoying to dangerous as rates ratcheted up. Katie didn't mock any of them. She'd stood in enough machine sheds at midnight with broke equipment to know how fast necessity looks like extravagance from the outside. Plenty of finance purchases had true returns. Plenty of borrowed acres fed families. Debt wasn't sin. Debt was force, useful when controlled, fatal when it controlled you. What made her different was not virtue. It was threshold. She had set hers decades earlier and never moved it for pride. April came late and cold. Then May turned mean in a different way. No rain worth measuring. Winds scoured topsoil into fence lines. Corn that should have pushed hard sat short and stubborn, leaf tips curling by noon. At the same time, borrowing costs jumped again. First Plains sent revised notices on variable lines. Farm credit offices tightened covenant language. Co-op credit committees got religion about receivables. By June, the two defaults that had triggered the co-op policy were no longer rumors with blurred names. Ryder Brothers Ag filed restructuring paperwork in district court with approximately $6.7 million total liabilities against assets that appraised lower under stress pricing than their previous year statements showed. Their operating line had reset twice. A fertilizer pre-buy finance short at high rates collided with lower basis and lower than projected yields. Cash burn outran collateral. The second was Harp and Son Farms south of Inland. They had $3.9 million in combined land, equipment, and operating debt, and carried a fleet modern enough to run circles around most of the county. Then a hail event clipped production, insurance timing lagged, and variable interest chewed through what working capital they had left. They missed 2 scheduled payments and got pushed into liquidation talks on non-core parcels. In July, Adams County Grain and Feed, everybody just called it the elevator, sent a letter to producers warning of temporary intake constraints if short-term liquidity wasn't secured before harvest. Translation: they were tight enough that one more bad week could interrupt receiving. The letter hit like a thunderclap in a dry sky. Without reliable intake, harvest logistics broke down fast. Trucks waited. Moisture discounts mounted. Basis widened. Every farm, conservative or leveraged, took damage. At the diner on Highway 6, conversations changed tone from competitive to grim. People who had spent years arguing brands now traded lender terms in low voices over eggs. Someone said Prime would climb again. Someone else said no way. A third person said it didn't matter because his renewal was already north of 12. Tyler came by one evening as the sun dropped red through dust and sat on Katie's tailgate, elbows on knees. Dad's line got repriced, he said quietly. 9.8 to 11.1 variable. They want additional collateral if we expand acres next year. Katie waited. He says we should chase more acres anyway, or we're done in 5 years. Tyler stared at his boots. I don't know if done comes faster from staying small or borrowing big. Katie took a long breath. Done comes when fixed obligations outrun bad year cash flow. Size doesn't save you from that. He nodded like he wanted certainty and knew he wouldn't get it. That night she updated her whiteboard. Under yield is weather, she wrote. Current field estimates, all lower than June projections. Under price is market, she wrote bids and basis spreads. Under debt is choice, she wrote one line. Choice made before panic. By August, dryland yields were down hard across parts of the county. Irrigated acres merely disappointed instead of failed, and lenders were calling in weekly reports from operators they had barely monitored 2 years earlier. Vernon still ran fast, but his laughter at the co-op counter had thinned. He sold a near-new grain cart to cover short-term obligations and called it fleet optimization. Nobody corrected him. Darren Pike at the co-op looked 10 years older than Spring when Katie ran into him by the fertilizer tanks. You hear about the elevator meeting Thursday? He asked. I heard there's a meeting. Not optional, he said. If they suspend intake in September, we all wear it. He rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers. Board's asking for emergency options. County officials coming. Bank reps, too. Katie nodded once. When she got home, she pulled a legal pad from the drawer, wrote elevator scenarios at the top, and began building columns. Immediate cash need, receivable risk, producer equity structures, governance terms, transparency requirements, downside contingencies. Outside, a hot wind moved through tasseled corn that should have been taller. Inside, she wrote until the house was quiet enough to hear the pen tip drag. She did not write speeches. She wrote terms. She wrote terms. On Thursday, the town hall crowd filled the Hastings High School commons before sunset. Folding chairs scraped the tile. Seed caps and work jackets packed the rows. The smell was coffee, sweat, and dust carried in on boots. At the front table sat the elevator board, Darren Pike from the co-op, 2 county supervisors, and Caleb Wren from First Plains Bank, with a leather folder he kept opening and closing. Katie came in last, legal pad under her arm, sandals still tied with twine. No one missed them. Board President Hank Wirtz tapped the mic. We'll keep this plain. Adams County Grain and Feed has a short-term liquidity gap projected at $1.06 million through peak intake. If we do nothing, we may have to cap receiving days in September. A low wave moved through the room. Murmurs, a curse, somebody whispering we're dead if that happens. Hank continued. First, Plains has offered an emergency facility. Terms are expensive. County backstop is possible, but not guaranteed. We need options tonight. Caleb stood, smooth voice, banker calm. Facility would be 12.9 variable, first position on receivables, monthly covenant reporting, and temporary authority for management to secure additional short-term debt if basis widens. Temporary meaning what? Someone shouted. 18 months, Caleb said. Meaning forever, someone else answered. Vernon Lyle rose without waiting for a mic. You don't get credit by pretending cash-only fairy tale scale. We need real money now. Sign the line and keep moving. A few clapped. More didn't. Katie stayed seated in the back for another 10 minutes while the room argued itself in circles. Blame, rates, weather, politics, whose fault, whose risk. When Hank asked for concrete proposals, silence settled like dust. Then Katie stood. Not dramatic, just stood, legal pad in hand, and walked up the aisle while heads turned. Vernon smirked at first, then stopped when she handed Hank a stapled packet printed in black and white. Hank read the top line out loud, frowning at first, then blinking. Proposal for producer-owned stabilization structure, he said. Submitted by Katie Jordan. Jordan Farm Holdings. She took the mic. I'll make this short. I can commit $1.2 million cash. The Commons went still. I'll wire within 48 hours after legal docs are signed, she said. Not a donation, structured capital. But my terms are non-negotiable. Caleb straightened in his chair. Vernon actually laughed once, sharp, unbelieving. From where, Katie? The coffee can? She ignored him. Term 1, she said, tapping the packet. Membership bylaws must cap manager debt authority at $200,000 without full member vote. No more quiet leverage in the dark. Term 2, quarterly balance sheets posted for all members. Plain language, no bearing. Term 3, producer oversight committee of 7, elected 1-year staggered seats. Term 4, no executive bonuses until retained earnings recover above preset threshold. Term 5, any bridge advances go first to farms under 1,200 acres that submit cash flow sheets. No politics. Hank looked up slowly. You're serious? Yes. Caleb asked, do you have proof of funds? Katie pulled one more page from her folder and handed it to him. It was on Ruth Engel's letterhead with attached account confirmations and maturity dates. Ruth had come in quietly and was now standing along the side wall in a tan coat, arms crossed. Caleb read, jaw tightening. This says, liquid and near-liquid assets available inside 7 business days exceed $1.38 million. Correct, Katie said. He flipped to the next page. His eyebrows climbed despite himself. and stated net worth. He paused, then read it because the room was waiting. $12,206,400. You could hear the gym HVAC kick on. Someone in row 3 let out a low whistle. A woman near the back said, not quietly, "Lord." Vernon's face changed first to red, then to something flatter. "Those are paper numbers." Ruth spoke from the wall. "They are documented numbers, filed numbers, audited tax numbers. If you'd like footnotes, I brought footnotes." A few people laughed, short, shocked laughter that broke the tension. Hank rubbed his forehead. "Katie, why haven't we known this?" She answered without heat. "Because my balance sheet isn't a parade float." Then she looked over the crowd, voice steady. "You all thought this was about whether I could borrow at 11 or 12%. It was never that. It's about whether this county wants to keep paying compounding interest for the privilege of reacting late." No one interrupted. "I'm offering capital because intake failure hurts everybody, including me. But if my money goes in, sunlight goes in with it." For the first time all night, the room had something solid to argue with. They argued for 90 more minutes anyway. 3 large operators objected to published quarterly statements. Private business, competitive sensitivity. Nobody else does this. Katie answered each with numbers, not speeches. If you want member equity, members get member visibility. Caleb warned that tight debt caps could reduce financing flexibility. Katie nodded. "Then bring terms to a vote. Flexibility without consent is just a nicer word for surprise." Darren Pike, exhausted and blunt, spoke into the mic. "If we cap intake this fall, many of us take basis hits bigger than our annual fuel bills. We're talking 6-figure losses countywide. I don't care whose pride hurts. We need the grain moving." A corn grower from Juniata stood and asked the practical question everyone was circling. "How's the 1.2 structured?" Katie turned a page. 800,000 as subordinated working capital note to the elevator, 3% simple interest, 5-year amortization, first 12 months interested only, 250,000 into a zero-interest harvest bridge pool, max 40,000 per operation, 120-day term, must submit projected cash flow and a repayment source. 150,000 reserve for immediate logistics, propane, diesel, and critical repair vouchers tied directly to harvest throughput. Heads started nodding. This wasn't charity theater. It was architecture. She kept going. Any farm over 1,200 acres can still apply for bridge funds after day 20 if pool isn't fully allocated. No exclusions, just priority order. If default rate exceeds 8%, committee freezes new advances and resets criteria. A younger producer in the second row raised a hand. "Who runs approvals?" 3 signatures, Katie said. 1 from Elevator Oversight Committee, 1 from Co-op Operations, 1 independent. Ruth agreed to serve pro bono first season if elected committee confirms. Ruth gave 1 curt nod. Hank called the vote at 9:14 p.m. Membership restructuring with Jordan terms passed 61-9. The 9 no votes came fast and loud. The 61 looked like relief. Afterward, people formed a line to ask Katie questions she'd never been asked before. Not what boots she wore, but what ratio she used for repairs reserve, what she counted as true liquidity, how she stress-tested rent bids. Vernon walked out without speaking to anyone. At 7:30 the next morning, Katie sat in the elevator conference room with Hank, Darren, Ruth, the co-op attorney, and 2 elected producers, Paula Holland and Luis Ortega. Coffee cups, yellow highlighters, stack of draft bylaws. This was where generosity became paperwork. Ruth slid a spreadsheet to the center. Before funds move, I want everyone clear on why this structure works and why the old one broke. She pointed to the first column, interest sensitivity analysis. At prior debt pace, every 1% rate increase added approximately $118,000 annual cost to elevator and member-linked short-term financing exposure, she said. Rates moved more than that, then liquidity cushion did not. Second column, management discretion, debt. No hard cap meant obligations could expand faster than member awareness. That's governance failure, not weather. Third column, cash conversion timing. Average receivable collection stretched from 19 days to 43 in 2 years. That gap has to be financed. If financing costs spike, gap becomes threat. Katie added her own sheet beside Ruth's, handwritten, ruler-straight lines. Here's my side because people keep asking if this is luck. It was a year-by-year extraction from her ledgers, not every year, but enough to show pattern. 2000 to 2004. Extra principal payments totaling $42,900 beyond schedule on initial land note. Estimated interest avoided over life of note, $23,700, 2005 to 2009. Deferred equipment upgrades, bought used with cash differential of $164,000 versus financed new equivalents. Avoided interest and depreciation drag, about $61,000 plus lower annual fixed costs. 2010 to 2014. Maintained household draw at $42,000 while peers rose. Cumulative retained business cash increase versus regional average draw, roughly $287,000. 2015 to 2019. Land purchases with high cash down and short notes retired early. Estimated interest avoided, $96,400. 2020 to 2025. Reserve ladder, CD/T-bills, earned $173,000 plus while preserving liquidity. No machinery notes added despite high-income years. She tapped the bottom line she'd boxed in blue ink. Avoided interest. Conservative estimate across 25 years, $418,100. That's before compounding effects on later flexibility. Louise leaned back slowly. So the Sandals are, what, a hedge fund? Paula laughed in spite of herself. Sandals are sandals, Katie said. Discipline is the asset. Ruth pointed to another line. And for everyone who thinks this model required being big from the start, it didn't. Her acreage grew after the structure was in place, not before. They spent 4 hours tightening criteria for the bridge pool. Max advance, $40,000, required docs, 1-page cash flow projection, crop insurance status, marketing plan or delivery contract, repayment trigger, first grain settlement or insurance receipt, late penalty, none in first season, but mandatory counseling with extension office if past due, transparency. Anonymized quarterly report to membership with total disbursed, repayment rate, delinquency. By noon, documents were signed. By 12:17 p.m., Katie initiated the first wire, $800,000 to Adams County Grain and Feed Stabilization Account. At 12:19 p.m., second wire, $250,000 to producer Bridge Pool Escrow. At 12:22 p.m., third wire, $150,000 to Harvest Logistics Reserve. No speech. Just confirmation numbers printed and stapled. Applications open Monday at 8 a.m. in the elevator office lobby. Folding table, clipboards, coffee thermos, 3 pens on strings like a small-town bank in 1987. By 8:40, 7 farmers were in line. Paula and Jeff Holland were approved first, $34,500 bridge advance for diesel and payroll timing, plus $7,200 propane voucher for grain drying. Outcome, their dryers stayed running through a wet week in September, and they avoided selling corn early at a 22-cent below expected basis just to make cash. Second, Ortiz Brothers, 540 acres, approved $21,000 for truck transmission replacement and seasonal labor float. Outcome, they kept hauling directly instead of paying emergency commercial rates, preserving about $11,000 in net margin. Third, Tyler's family operation, after 2 days of arguing at their own kitchen table, accepted $18,000 bridge funds tied to a signed repayment plan from contracted soybean delivery. Outcome, they avoided drawing an additional variable tranche at 11.1% from their bank for the same shortfall window. Fourth, Lena Coe, first-generation renter on 310 acres, approved $12,800 for fungicide and harvest fuel timing. Outcome, she harvested on schedule and repaid in 47 days, then volunteered to help other applicants complete worksheets. By the end of week 1, 14 farms had received a combined $286,300, bridge plus logistics vouchers. By week 3, total reached $463,900 across 23 farms. 90-day repayment performance sat at 96% on time, with one extension granted after a medical emergency. And the elevator never suspended intake. On the first big harvest Monday, trucks lined up before dawn under sodium lights, scale tickets printed without interruption. Darren walked the catwalk above the pit with a radio in hand, and for the first time in weeks, stopped sounding like a man waiting for impact. At 10:15 a.m., he found Katie near the dump grate, writing moisture numbers on her legal pad. "You know this actually worked," he said. She didn't look up. "It worked because everybody followed rules for once." He smiled. "People are calling it the Jordan Plan." Katie snorted softly. "Call it not running out of cash plan." That Thursday, the Oversight Committee posted the first required balance sheet on a corkboard in the lobby and online in a plain PDF. Cash on hand, receivables aging, short-term obligations, bridge pool status, nothing hidden behind jargon. Farmers stood in front of it with coffee cups, tracing lines with calloused fingers. Some hated how exposed it felt. Most kept reading. Vernon came in, scanned the sheet, and left without comment. Tyler arrived later and stayed 20 minutes. When Katie walked in, he tapped the page where liabilities were listed in clean blocks. "I've never seen numbers laid out like this unless it was too late," he said. "That's why we do it early," Katie said. He glanced down at her sandals and shook his head with a half laugh. "I used to think you were just stubborn." "I am stubborn." "No," he said, eyes back on the balance sheet. "This is something else." Katie capped her pen. "It's math with a memory." Outside trucks kept rolling across the scale, each one loud, ordinary, and now possible. Outside trucks kept rolling across the scale, each one loud, ordinary, and now possible. By the third week of October, the line at the elevator office had changed from anxious to purposeful. The folding table was still there, but now people came in carrying settlement checks instead of blank applications. Paula Holland stepped up first on a cold Tuesday morning, cheeks red from wind, chore boots still dusted white from the dairy lot. Jeff stood behind her holding a thermos and their repayment worksheet, folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft. Darren took the envelope, counted, and looked up. 34.5 principal, on time, plus the propane voucher reimbursement from first settlement. You beat due date by 6 days. Paula let out a breath she'd been holding since August. Dryer never shut down once. Jeff added, if it had, we'd have dumped wet and eaten it on discounts. Luis Ortega, now serving as chair of the Oversight Committee, wrote the payment on the board in black marker where anyone in the lobby could see. Holland, paid in full. Paula watched him write it, then turned to Katie, who was leaning against the wall with her legal pad. I used to think this stuff was for people who like spreadsheets, Paula said. Turns out it's for people who like sleeping. Katie gave the smallest smile. Sleeping is underrated. Next came Ortiz brothers. Mateo Ortiz carried in a cashier's check with oil under his fingernails from fixing trucks all night. That transmission would have parked us for 10 days, he told Darren. Commercial hauling quote was $8,700 for the week. Would have wrecked us. Darren marked the ledger. 21,000 received. On time. Mateo pointed at the public balance sheet pinned beside the door. My dad says this is the first time in 30 years he's trusted a board because he can see what they're doing before they do it. Luis capped his marker. Tell your dad to come to Thursday's review. We need people who read line items. Tyler came in around noon, shoulders tight the way they got when he was bracing for bad news out of habit. He set down an envelope and a second sheet with his own handwritten note. What's this? Ruth asked from the back desk where she was reviewing files. Repayment and a revised 2027 plan, Tyler said. We're not bidding the Jensen lease. Dad wanted to push. We ran it again with higher rates and realistic yields. He tapped the margin where he'd written the stress case in block letters. Bad year survival greater than good year ego. Katie read it, handed it back, and said, That line'll keep you farming. Tyler looked almost embarrassed at the praise. I stole it from you, sort of. Good, she said. Steal better things, too. Lena Coe arrived last that day, hair tucked in a wool cap, fingers ink-stained from keeping her own books at night. She slid her payment receipt across the desk, then another paper clipped behind it. What's this one? Darren asked. My lease renewal, Lena said, unable to suppress a grin. Owner gave me 3 years instead of 1. Said I was the first tenant who brought him a cash flow plan before asking for acres. Luis gave a low whistle. That's how it starts. Lena nodded toward the application table. Got time this afternoon. You want help with the new folks' forms? By sunset, she had helped 4 growers complete their paperwork correctly enough that Ruth only had to circle one number. The multiplier effect showed up in places no one had forecast on the first night. When the Hollands stayed on schedule through drying season, they didn't sell cows to make short-term cash. That meant they kept milk volume steady through winter. Their feed supplier got paid on time. The supplier kept 2 drivers full-time instead of cutting hours. One of those drivers was a single father from Glenville who had been one missed payroll from moving his kids out of district. When Ortiz brothers kept hauling themselves, they avoided emergency freight rates and had enough margin left to hire 2 high school kids for Saturday loading. One of those kids, Eli Nelson, signed up for the winter cash flow class because he heard it's the only room where adults talk about money without pretending. When Tyler's family skipped the Jensen lease, the acreage went to a beginning operator out of Inland who could actually cash flow it without a heroic price forecast. That operator applied to the bridge pool in spring with complete paperwork and repaid in 71 days. His landlord later told Hank Wirtz, I'd rather have a tenant who sleeps than one who brags. By November, bridge pool performance sat at 97%, repaid on time. One loan extension remained open for a medical emergency, documented and approved. No defaults. At the oversight meeting that month, Hank read the numbers aloud to a room that had once shouted itself hoarse over whether transparency was insulting. Total bridge disbursed this season. $492,600, he said. Repaid to date, $477,300. Outstanding by agreement, 15-3. Delinquent, 0. He looked over at Katie. You were right. Katie didn't look up from her notes. Numbers were right. Hank snorted. You know what I mean. Darren stacked the payment reports and added, intake never capped. Basis damage avoided by conservative estimate. Countywide between 600,000 and 900,000. Ruth corrected him, dry as always. Use a narrower range if you want anyone to trust you. Darren grinned. Fine. 742,000 by Ruth math. Better. Silence held for a second, the good kind, the kind where people were calculating what staying open had actually done. Louise broke it. Motion to convert this emergency structure into standing policy and create a permanent revolving input fund for first-generation farmers. 0 interest, mandatory training. Heads turned toward Katie. She closed her pad. I'll seed it with 500,000 if training's real, not a checkbox. Ruth raised one eyebrow. Define real. Cash flow planning, debt structure, stress testing, and quarterly reporting basics. Attendance required, graduation required before money moves. Lena, sitting at the end of the table with a yellow notebook, spoke up. Add lease negotiation basics. New growers get eaten alive on rent language. Paula nodded hard. And household draw limits. Nobody teaches that till after mistakes. Hank looked around. All in favor? Every hand in the room went up, including 2 that had voted no in August. In December, snow came sideways for 2 days and pinned everyone indoors except people with livestock and bad judgment. By Friday, the roads cleared enough for the coffee counter crowd to reconvene at Miller's Diner, where opinions thawed faster than parking lots. Vernon Lyle was already there when Katie walked in, nursing black coffee and staring at a legal notice folded beside his plate. No logo jacket this time. Plain canvas coat, zipper broken near the neck. He saw her, hesitated, then lifted 2 fingers at the empty stool across from him. Katie sat. For a full minute they watched steam rise from their cups and listened to somebody at the end of the counter arguing about soybean basis in Iowa. Vernon spoke first. Sold the grain cart. One of the planters, too. Katie waited. Lost 600 leased acres at renewal. He swallowed, jaw working once. Landlord said he wanted a lower-risk tenant profile. His words. You keeping the home quarter? She asked. Yeah. A bitter laugh. For now? He unfolded the notice and pushed it toward her. It was a restructuring agreement, tight covenants, fixed reporting dates, mandatory asset sales schedule. Ugly, but survivable. I called you stubborn for years, he said, eyes on the paper. Turns out I was financed to the eyelids and calling it growth. Katie slid the notice back. You're not dead yet. Feels close some days. She nodded toward the diner window where trucks hissed past on wet pavement. Then stop performing and start repairing. He gave her a look halfway between annoyance and respect. You going to gloat? No. Why not? She took a sip of coffee. Because I've buried enough people and enough plans to know humiliation doesn't pay notes. He sat with that, then quieter. Can I sit in on that training class? The one you're funding. It's open to anyone who does the work. I'm not first generation. You are at starting over. That finally got a short, real laugh out of him. Fair. At the register, as they stood to leave, Vernon said what he should have said months ago. I was wrong about you, Katie. She tugged her gloves on. Be right about your numbers now. Year-end books closed in Ruth Engel's office on a gray January afternoon, with sleet ticking against the window like thrown gravel. Ruth printed 2 copies, stapled them, and slid one to Katie. Jordan Farm Holdings, fiscal year close, she said. Bad weather year, but final margin 11.08% after true depreciation, taxes accrued, no debt service because there is none. Katie scanned line items, pen-tapping once at repairs. Higher than projected, she said. Because you prepaid inputs and took discount, and because machinery didn't own you, Ruth replied. Also because you didn't panic sell grain at harvest low. Across from them, Caleb Wren from First Plains shifted in his chair. He'd requested this meeting after the elevator restructuring became county news, and the bank board demanded context for why they'd been publicly outmaneuvered by a woman they'd tagged unverified. Caleb cleared his throat. Ms. Jordan, I owe you an apology for how we framed your profile. Katie kept reading. You framed your system. I just didn't fit inside it. He nodded, accepting the hit. We're building a cash verification pathway that doesn't require existing operating debt as proof of creditworthiness. Ruth looked up sharply. You mean common sense? He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am, with documentation. Katie signed the final page, then slid a separate packet across to Ruth. File the elevator documents and the fund charter, she said. List me as lead investor where required. Ruth opened it, scanned the first page, and whistled once. You're sure you want this public? Doesn't matter what I want, it's required. The next week, county filings made it official. Katie Jordan, lead investor in the restructured Adams County Grain and Feed, founder and principal backer of the Jordan Revolving Input Fund, initial capitalization, $500,000, 0 interest, training required. By Friday, everyone in Hastings knew exactly how wrong they'd been about the woman with torn sandals. The first training night filled the extension classroom past capacity. Metal chairs, burnt coffee, projector humming, whiteboard squeaking under fresh marker. At the front stood Ruth with a stack of worksheets, Luis with a laptop, Lena with attendance sheets, and Katie with her old legal pad. Rule 1, Ruth said to the room, if your numbers only work in a perfect year, your numbers don't work. Lena handed out packets labeled cash flow under stress. Tyler sat in the second row with his dad. Vernon sat in the back, hat in his lap, taking notes in block letters like a freshman. Paula spoke from the side wall about household draw discipline. Jeff explained what 1 week of dryer downtime costs in real dollars. Darren walked through elevator statements, line by line, so people could see exactly where cash got tight. Caleb attended 2 sessions silently, then offered a fixed-rate worksheet template his bank had developed after, in his words, learning the hard way. Halfway through the night, a kid barely out of high school raised his hand. What's rich, then? If it ain't the biggest tractor? The room turned toward Katie. She set her pen down. Rich is what you owe, she said. Preferably nothing. No one laughed. They just wrote it down. 3 seasons later, on a bright July Saturday, Hastings Market smelled like peaches and hot asphalt. A new generation of growers lined the aisle with clean logos and contactless payment signs, and now laminated cash flow cards tucked beside them because training had become habit, not punishment. Katie's stand looked almost unchanged. Sweet corn in neat rows, handwritten cards, coffee can for change, cracked phone, replaced once but cracked again. The 1994 Ford still running, now with primer on one fender. Her old $71,000 combine still harvesting, repaint faded, engine dependable, because she serviced it on schedule and never skipped the boring things. Her sandals were different leather, same repair method. Baling twine at the strap, feed sack patch at the heel. A little girl at the stand, Eli Nelson's niece, maybe 8 years old, pointed at them and asked, "Miss Katie, why don't you buy new ones? You're rich." Katie knelt so they were eye level. "These still work." "But you could get shiny ones?" "I could," Katie smiled. "Leather fails slower than ego, though." The girl frowned, considering this as if it might be on a test later. "What's ego?" "Thinking people owe you applause for money you borrowed." Behind them, Tyler loaded corn into a customer's tote while talking acreage plans with Lena, who now farmed 520 acres, half owned, all cash flowed. Paula and Jeff had reduced short-term liabilities by more than half and hired one full-time employee they could pay in every month, not just good ones. Luis was in his second term on the Elevator Oversight Committee and had become the county's most annoying advocate for plain language balance sheets. Darren still ran co-op operations, but now posted receivables, aging publicly without waiting to be asked. Hank had retired from board leadership and spent Saturdays teaching teenagers how to read settlement sheets before signing anything. Mason Ryder's operation had downsized, sold non-core equipment, and survived under a court-approved plan that looked nothing like his old growth model and a lot like Katie's warning. Harp and Son sold 2 parcels, kept their home acres, and built a decent custom harvest business that carried less debt and more sleep. Caleb stayed at First Plains, older in the face, and became the loan officer who asked, first, "Show me your bad year case." Vernon farmed fewer acres and quieter now. He drove an older truck, wore plain coats, and taught one module in the winter class called How I Mistook Leverage for Invincibility. He opened it the same way every time. "If you came for pride, wrong room." As for Katie, she kept doing what she'd always done. Budget first, ego last, market on Saturdays when harvest allowed, cemetery on Ben's birthday with fresh-cut flowers, and an update on the numbers because habits become prayer when repeated long enough. At dusk, when the market thinned and vendors packed up, she slid the coffee can into the passenger seat, patted the dashboard twice, and started the Ford on the second turn. No parade, no speech, just one more ordinary exit. In Adams County, kids now learned farm finance from a story adults used to tell as a joke. The poorest-looking farmer was the richest one, and not because she won a lottery or guessed a market top, but because she decided, year after year, purchase after purchase, that compounding could work for her instead of against her. The lesson lasted because it was visible. In ledger pages, in posted balance sheets, in farms still operating after bad weather, in debt notes crossed out in thick black pen, in a grain elevator that stayed open when it could have gone dark. And every Saturday morning, if you stand near the center aisle by 7:30, you can still watch Katie Jordan step down from that old Ford in patched sandals, carry in sweet corn with both hands, and prove the same thesis without saying a word. Wealth is not what shines. Wealth is what stays.